last Friday night, Nicole was out late again. I didn't bother texting her. She'd told me she was going to the gym, but her workout had been done hours ago. You don't spend 4 hours doing yoga, not unless you're training to be some kind of ninja. By midnight, I was sitting in the dark, staring at the front door, waiting for her to come home like a goddamn fool. And then the door creaked open. She tiptoed in like I wouldn't notice. I watched from the shadows as she slipped off her shoes quietly, dropped her bag by the door, and moved toward the stairs. She hadn't seen me yet. Long workout? I asked, my voice cutting through the silence. Nicole froze, just for a second, before she turned slowly to face me. Her face was calm, but her eyes, they betrayed her. They were wide, surprised. Almost like she hadn't expected me to be waiting for her. Yeah, it was tough tonight, she said, not missing a beat. A new class. I'm exhausted. A new class? Right. She didn't even look sweaty. She smelled like fresh perfume. Oh, really? I stood up, walking toward her slowly. Is that why you came home smelling like that, instead of sweat? Her eyes narrowed for a second, and then she let out a forced laugh. You're imagining things. I think you've been up too late. I didn't respond, just watched her carefully as she walked up the stairs, her back turned to me. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I didn't stop her. Not yet. That night, I didn't sleep. I laid awake thinking. The gym. Perfume. Late nights. My gut had been screaming at me for weeks, and I'd ignored it. But not anymore. Something was wrong. Something big. And I was going to find out exactly what. I couldn't let it go after that night. Something inside me had shifted. I didn't confront her right away, though. I knew if I just came out swinging with accusations, she'd shut me down, probably feed me some more of her bullshit excuses. No, I had to play it smart. The next morning, Nicole acted like nothing had happened. She breezed through breakfast, scrolling through her phone while sipping her coffee. Same routine, different day. She gave me the usual quick peck on the cheek before heading out to meet with a friend for lunch. No name, no details, just vague enough to piss me off without raising any suspicions that I was onto her. Once the door shut behind her, I was alone in the house, standing in the middle of the kitchen, just boiling. I needed to calm down, needed to think. I grabbed my phone, pulled up her name, and stared at it. Should I snoop through her phone? No, she never left it lying around long enough. She was too careful for that. Always had it within reach. But what about her laptop? Nicole sometimes worked from home, and she wasn't as cautious with her MacBook. I walked over to the small desk in the living room where she kept it, plugged in to charge as always. She never used a password on it, thinking the house was private enough. My hands were steady as I flipped open the screen and the laptop whirred to life. Her emails were the first thing I checked. Boring. Work stuff, newsletters she probably never read. Nothing unusual. But then, as I scrolled deeper, I found something, a confirmation email for a hotel booking. The subject line was innocuous, just the name of the hotel and a check-in date. My heart pounded as I clicked on it. The details unfolded in front of me, and there it was, black and white, a reservation for 2 at a place downtown, not far from her office. I stared at the screen, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. She wasn't away on any business trip or meeting a friend. She'd spent the night at a hotel, and she hadn't told me. The check-in date was last Thursday, the night she said she'd gone to yoga and then for drinks with her girlfriends. My stomach clenched. I scrolled down, looking for more information, and there it was. The room was booked under Nicole's name but with a note, additional guest, Michael Bennett. Michael Bennett. I didn't know any Michael Bennett. That wasn't one of her co-workers, at least none she'd ever mentioned to me. My throat felt tight as I stared at the name, trying to make sense of it. I clicked out of her email, closing the laptop, and sat back in the chair, my head spinning. I had no proof yet, not really. A hotel booking could mean anything, right? Maybe it was innocent. Maybe this guy was a colleague who needed help with a presentation, and they were working late. Sure. That had to be it. But that was a lie I wanted to believe, not one that made any real sense. I stood up, pacing the living room, my fists clenched. No, I couldn't let this go. She was hiding something from me, and I needed to know what. I grabbed my car keys and headed out. If I wanted answers, I had to start following the trail. And the first stop was that hotel. The place was one of those upscale boutique hotels, the kind where you paid extra just to get a half-decent room and some fancy toiletries. The kind of place Nicole had no business being in without me. I parked in the garage and walked straight up to the front desk, rehearsing the excuse I'd practiced in my head on the drive over. I'm here to check up on a reservation. My wife stayed here last Thursday night, and I just wanted to verify something. She said there was an issue with the bill, I said, keeping my tone casual, trying not to sound like a guy whose world was slowly imploding. The woman at the desk smiled politely, typing away at her computer. Of course, sir. What's the name on the reservation? Nicole Anderson, I replied, leaning on the counter, my palms starting to sweat. She clicked a few more times before nodding. Yes, I see the reservation here. Is there anything specific you need help with regarding the bill? Yeah, actually. Could you confirm the total for me? She mentioned something about an additional guest, and I just want to make sure it was charged correctly. The woman clicked a couple more times, her eyes scanning the screen. Yes, the room was booked for 2 guests. It was charged appropriately. I can print the receipt if you'd like. No, that's okay, I said, waving her off. I just needed to make sure. Thanks. I walked out of the hotel with my head spinning, clutching my car keys so hard they dug into my palm. She had stayed there. She had booked the room for 2 people. And she hadn't said a goddamn word about it to me. Back at home, I paced the living room again, trying to think straight. The hotel wasn't enough. I needed more proof. I didn't want to confront her until I had everything laid out. There'd be no room for her to wiggle out of this. She'd lie if I asked her now, tell me some bullshit story about how it was work-related or just a friend crashing after drinks. No, I wasn't giving her that chance. I decided to go through her phone records next. I had access to our shared mobile account, so it wasn't difficult to check her recent calls and texts. Scrolling through the list, I saw her usual contacts, her mom, her best friend, a few work calls. And then I saw it, Michael Bennett. His name popped up multiple times over the past few weeks, sometimes late at night, sometimes in the middle of the day. Short calls, long ones, some lasting an hour or more. I looked at the dates. Some of those calls lined up perfectly with the nights she claimed she'd been out with friends. My hands trembled as I pieced it together. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't just a friend. He was more than that. And Nicole had been lying to me for weeks, maybe months. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had to know more. I logged into our shared phone account again, this time checking the location history. I hadn't thought much about this feature before, but now, it became my lifeline to the truth. I scrolled through the logs from the past month, checking where Nicole's phone had been on the nights she'd claimed to be at the gym or out with friends. Sure enough, on 3 separate occasions, her phone had pinged at the same location, the hotel downtown. I sat down heavily on the couch, my head in my hands. It was all there. The hotel, the calls, the location history. She was cheating. There was no other explanation. But I still didn't have the final piece of the puzzle. I needed to know who this Michael Bennett was. Was he just some guy she met at work? A gym buddy? A random fling? I needed to see him, face to face. That night, I waited for Nicole to come home. When she walked through the door, I played it cool, asking her about her day, pretending like everything was normal. She smiled, told me she'd had lunch with her friend Sarah, made up some excuse about needing to stay late at work tomorrow night. I nodded along, but inside, my mind was racing. After dinner, she went upstairs to shower, and I took my chance. Her phone was on the kitchen counter, locked, but I had seen her enter her passcode 100 times before. I picked it up, my heart pounding, and unlocked it with trembling fingers. I opened her messages and searched for Michael's name. There it was, a whole thread of texts, most of them recent. My breath caught in my throat as I scrolled through. Some of them were innocent, at least on the surface. Had a great time today, can't wait to see you again, missing you already. But then, as I scrolled further back, the messages grew more explicit, more intimate. I'm counting the minutes until I can see you again, one read. Another, from Nicole, last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about it. I dropped the phone onto the counter like it had burned my hand. That was it. That was all the proof I needed. Nicole was cheating, and she hadn't even tried to hide it. She just let it happen, right under my nose. My head spun, my stomach churned. I felt sick, angry, betrayed, all at once. I wanted to throw something, smash something, scream at the top of my lungs. But I didn't. I had the proof, and now, I had a plan. The hardest part wasn't the waiting. It was pretending like nothing had changed, acting like everything was normal when inside, I was ready to explode. Nicole spent the next day at work, completely unaware of what I had discovered. I kept myself busy too, working from home and trying not to let my mind wander to the messages I'd read or the hours she'd spent with him. But that night, when she walked through the door, I was ready. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked casually, kicking off her shoes and tossing her bag on the kitchen table like always. She grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, drinking it like she had no care in the world. "Fine," I replied, my voice flat, watching her closely. She didn't notice. She never noticed anything lately. Not me, not the tension in the air, not the way my eyes were burning holes into her back. Nicole headed upstairs for a shower, leaving her phone on the counter like it was nothing. Like she had nothing to hide. But I knew the truth now. I had all the pieces. The hotel booking, the texts, the calls. Every little lie she told me was swirling in my mind, and I was barely holding it together. When she came back down, freshly showered, wearing that damn oversized t-shirt she always slept in, I stood up from the couch. "Hey, can we talk?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. She glanced at me, raising an eyebrow. "About what?" "About you and Michael Bennett," I said, letting the words hang in the air between us. The change in her was instant. The casual smile on her face disappeared, her body stiffened, and she blinked at me, trying to figure out what I knew, how much I knew. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice a little too calm, a little too practiced. "I'm talking about the hotel," I said, stepping closer, my voice getting louder. "The one you booked for the two of you. The one you've been to 3 times in the last month. I'm talking about all the calls, the texts, the lies." She didn't respond right away. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me, like she was trying to decide which version of the truth she could spin this into. But I wasn't going to give her that chance. "I went through your phone," I said, my hands shaking. "I saw everything." Nicole's face went pale. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, she didn't have a lie ready. I almost wished she did. Anything was better than this silent, guilty expression on her face, this confirmation of everything I already knew. "How long?" I demanded, stepping closer to her, feeling the heat rising in my chest. "How long have you been sleeping with him?" She finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. It's not what you think." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Not what I think." "I saw the messages, Nicole. The ones where you said you couldn't wait to see him again, where you told him last night was incredible. So tell me, what the hell am I supposed to think?" She shook her head, stepping back, her hands trembling. It's not serious," she stammered. "I never meant for it to go this far. It was just something I did to feel better about myself. It didn't mean anything." "It didn't mean anything?" My voice was getting louder, my anger boiling over. "You're telling me that screwing some guy behind my back doesn't mean anything?" You've been lying to my face for weeks, maybe months, and you expect me to believe it's not serious? She started crying then, the tears falling fast, but I didn't feel anything. Not sympathy. Not sadness. Just rage. I'm sorry, she whispered, wiping at her eyes. I'm so sorry. I didn't know how to stop it. Didn't know how to stop it? I shot back, my voice full of disbelief. How about not starting it in the first place? How about telling me the truth before this whole thing got so out of control? She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I know I messed up. I don't even know why I did it. I felt lonely, and he was there, and. Don't you dare try to blame this on me, I interrupted, my voice cold. Don't you dare act like this is because you were lonely. I've been here every damn day, and you never once said anything to me about feeling lonely. Instead, you went and found someone else to screw. Her tears fell harder, and she covered her face with her hands. I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please, you have to believe me. It didn't mean anything. It was a mistake. A mistake? I shook my head. A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill. Sleeping with someone else? That's not a mistake, Nicole. That's a choice. You made a choice, and now you're going to live with the consequences. She looked up at me then, her eyes wide with fear. What are you going to do? I stared at her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch between us. I hadn't decided yet. Part of me wanted to pack my bags and walk out the door, never look back. But another part of me, the angrier, more spiteful part, wanted to make her pay. She had wrecked our marriage, thrown away everything we had built, and for what? Some fling with a guy I didn't even know? I didn't answer her question. Instead, I turned and walked into the kitchen, needing space. I needed to think, needed to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. Behind me, I could hear Nicole's soft sobs, but they didn't affect me. Not anymore. The next morning was tense, the air in the house heavy with everything unsaid. Nicole didn't look at me when she came downstairs. She poured herself a cup of coffee, then sat at the table in silence. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying all night, but I didn't care. I wasn't ready to feel bad for her yet. We didn't speak. I sat across from her, watching as she sipped her coffee, her hands still trembling slightly. There was so much I wanted to say, so much I wanted to scream at her, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. After a long stretch of silence, Nicole finally spoke. Are you going to leave me? I didn't look at her when I answered. I don't know. She didn't say anything after that, and I got up to leave the table. I couldn't sit there anymore, not with her. But as I walked out of the kitchen, I heard her say, I'll end it with him. I promise. I stopped, standing in the doorway, my back to her. You should have ended it before it started. I needed space. Time to think. So I left the house, grabbed my keys, and drove without a destination in mind. I just needed to be anywhere but there, anywhere but next to the woman who had just ripped my life apart. I ended up at a park across town, parking in the lot and walking down to the lake. The water was calm, the air cool, and for a moment, I felt like I could breathe again. But then, the thoughts came rushing back. Nicole. Michael Bennett. The hotel. The texts. I couldn't get it out of my head. Why hadn't I seen this coming? How had she kept it from me for so long? I thought back to all the nights she'd come home late, all the times she'd been distant, brushing off my questions with excuses that now felt painfully obvious. She'd been cheating right in front of me, and I hadn't even realized. I felt like a fool. But more than that, I felt betrayed. The woman I had trusted, the woman I had built a life with, had thrown it all away without a second thought. And for what? A quick thrill? A fling with some guy I didn't even know? No. This wasn't ending with her fake tears and empty promises. She'd said she'd end it with him, but I wasn't interested in her promises anymore. I was done believing her lies. I took out my phone and did the one thing I never thought I'd have to do. I looked up a divorce lawyer. By the time I got back home, the anger had settled into a cold, simmering resolve. Nicole was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. She didn't look at me when I walked in, didn't say anything. I didn't either. I went straight upstairs, grabbed my laptop, and set it down on the kitchen table. I opened a new tab and typed in the words, "cheating wife legal options." I spent that night researching, and by the time the sun came up, I had a plan. It was clear that Nicole wasn't just going to walk away from this without consequences. I was done playing the role of the clueless, forgiving husband. She wanted to play around with some other guy? Fine. She could do that. But she'd have to deal with the fallout. I wasn't about to let her walk away with half of everything we built together, not after what she did. I wasn't going to let her crawl back with fake apologies and empty promises. So, I took the first step. I called a lawyer. I found one through a recommendation from a friend who had been through a messy divorce himself. The guy was a shark. He specialized in situations like mine, where infidelity played a major role. His name was Tom, and from the first conversation we had, I knew I was in good hands. "I'm going to be straight with you, man," Tom said after I explained everything. "Cheating spouses don't get sympathy in court. Especially if you've got proof. We're going to hit her hard, but we're going to play it smart. I'm guessing you want to come out of this with as much as possible, right?" "Exactly," I replied. My voice was steady, but my mind was racing. "I don't want to lose half of everything to her." Tom chuckled darkly. "Don't worry. You won't." That morning, I started the process of locking down everything. Our bank accounts, our credit cards, the house. I wasn't about to let Nicole walk away with more than she deserved. I contacted the bank and had them freeze our joint account, ensuring that she couldn't drain it before I could file. I made sure all the bills were paid, and then I transferred as much as I legally could into an account in my name only. The next step was the house. I called a locksmith and had the locks changed while Nicole was at work. I wasn't kicking her out yet, that would come later, but I wanted to make sure that when the time came, I could lock her out of my life as easily as she'd locked me out of hers. It felt cold, calculated even, but I didn't care anymore. Every move I made was another nail in the coffin of our marriage, and I wasn't about to hesitate. Nicole had cheated, and now, she was going to pay for it. When Nicole came home that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, the divorce papers lying in front of me. She walked in, her face pale when she saw the stack of papers. "What's this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She knew, though. She had to know. "It's what happens when you cheat on your husband," I said flatly. I didn't even look at her as I spoke. I was focused on the papers, flipping through them, showing her every page she needed to sign. "I'm filing for divorce. You're going to sign these papers, and you're going to leave." Her eyes widened. "Wait. You can't just." "I can, and I am," I interrupted. "You're lucky I haven't kicked you out already." Nicole started to cry, the tears flowing freely down her face. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "Please, just give me a chance to fix this." I didn't even flinch. "No. There's no fixing this." I pushed the papers toward her. "Sign them." For a second, she just stood there, staring at me like she didn't recognize the man sitting in front of her. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she was expecting me to yell, to fight, to make this some drawn-out emotional scene. But I was past that. I was done giving her any more of me. She wiped at her eyes and shook her head, refusing to sit down. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm not signing anything. I'm not just going to let you do this." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "You don't have a choice, Nicole. You cheated. I have proof. You think any court is going to side with you? You'll be lucky if you get anything from me at all." She opened her mouth to argue, but then she stopped. She knew I was right. The anger started to creep in, replacing the guilt on her face. She was cornered, and she didn't like it. "This is how you're going to handle this?" she asked, her voice tight. "You're just going to throw everything away? We've been married for 8 years. You threw it away when you slept with someone else," I shot back. "I'm just making sure you don't take everything else down with you." She blinked at me, her jaw clenched, and for a moment, I thought she was going to hit me. But then she turned and stormed upstairs. I heard the bedroom door slam shut. I sat there for a while, staring at the divorce papers. I wanted her gone, but it wasn't going to be that easy. She wasn't going to walk away quietly. The next few days were tense. Nicole tried to act normal, but the distance between us was unbearable. She barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was short and cold. I was fine with that. I didn't want to talk to her anymore. But she still hadn't signed the papers. She was stalling, and I knew why. She was scared. She knew that once she signed those papers, once it was all official, her life as she knew it would be over. She wouldn't have access to the money, the house, any of it. She was afraid of losing the comfort she'd grown used to. But I wasn't backing down. I didn't bother trying to talk to her about it again. I knew that would get me nowhere. Instead, I let Tom handle it. He filed the papers anyway, even without her signature, and started the process. I made sure she knew that if she didn't cooperate, things would only get worse for her. That Friday, I made my next move. Nicole was out, probably meeting up with her friend again, but I didn't care. Let her go. While she was gone, I did something I hadn't planned to do. I called up her family. Her mom, specifically. Nicole had always been close to her parents, and I figured it was about time they knew exactly what their daughter had been up to. When her mom picked up the phone, I didn't bother with small talk. I went straight to the point. "I'm divorcing Nicole," I said, my voice steady. "She's been cheating on me." There was silence on the other end for a moment before her mom spoke, her voice confused. "What? That doesn't sound like Nicole at all." "Well, it is," I said, cutting her off. "She's been seeing some guy for months now. I've got the proof." Her mom stammered, trying to come up with something to say, but I didn't give her the chance. "I'm done with her," I said coldly. "She's not the person you think she is. I just thought you should know." And then I hung up. I knew Nicole's family would come down on her hard for this. They weren't the type to tolerate infidelity, not from anyone, least of all their daughter. It wasn't long before I heard her on the phone with her mom later that night, the sound of her muffled sobs coming from upstairs as she tried to explain herself. I didn't care. Let her deal with that. My next step was to make sure she felt it at work too. Nicole had a good job, made decent money, but I had a hunch that her little relationship with Michael wasn't just personal. They worked in the same industry, and it didn't take much digging to find out that they had worked together on a couple of recent projects. I didn't want to blow up her entire career, but I wasn't above making things difficult for her. So, I started with something small, an anonymous tip to her HR department about inappropriate relationships in the workplace. I didn't name names, but I gave enough details to make them look into it. I knew how these corporate environments worked. Even the slightest hint of scandal could throw a wrench in things. I didn't care how it affected her. If her life got a little more uncomfortable, good. Maybe then she'd start to realize just how badly she'd messed up. That weekend, Nicole finally broke. We hadn't spoken much since the confrontation, and I was doing my best to avoid her whenever possible. But on Sunday afternoon, she came downstairs and sat across from me at the kitchen table, the divorce papers in her hand. "I'll sign them," she said quietly, her voice broken. "But I want to talk first." I didn't respond. I just watched her, waiting. "I'm sorry," she said again, her eyes filling with tears. "I know you don't want to hear that, but I am. I never meant for this to happen." "You never meant for it to happen," I repeated, my voice flat. "But it did." "I know," she whispered. "And I know I don't deserve another chance, but, please. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. There is no us anymore, Nicole. You destroyed that. She started crying again, and this time, I didn't look away. I didn't offer comfort. I just let her sit there and cry, knowing that this was the bed she had made for herself. I'm going to sign the papers, she said again, her voice shaking. But I just want you to know that I'm sorry. I didn't say anything. She signed the papers that night, and when she handed them to me, I didn't even look at her. I just took them and walked away. By the time the papers were filed and the process was officially underway, I had locked Nicole out of every part of my life. She stayed in the house for now, but it was temporary. Once the legalities were sorted out, she'd be gone, and I'd never have to see her again. I thought it would feel good, watching her cry, watching her world crumble the way mine had. And maybe, in some ways, it did. But as I sat in the empty living room that night, the divorce papers finally signed and filed, I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. All I felt was empty. Revenge was just the beginning. If there was one thing that kept replaying in my mind after Nicole signed the divorce papers, it was the fact that Michael Bennett had walked away untouched. Sure, Nicole was about to lose everything. She was out of my life, her family had turned on her, and I'd tied her up in enough legal and financial knots that her life wouldn't be easy for a long time. But Michael? He was still out there, probably feeling like he'd gotten away with it. That's what bothered me most. I wasn't going to let him just disappear. He was the guy Nicole had been sneaking around with behind my back, and he needed to pay, too. I wasn't interested in some movie-style confrontation where I'd throw punches and leave it at that. No, I wanted to ruin him, the same way he'd helped ruin my marriage. So I started digging. The thing about Michael Bennett was that he wasn't some random guy Nicole met at the gym or out at a bar. He wasn't even some faceless office drone. He was a guy with connections, a corporate executive who worked in finance, more specifically, investment banking. He had a reputation to uphold, a career to maintain. He wasn't some idiot she'd met in passing. He was the kind of man who had a lot to lose. I spent days tracking down information on him. Social media, business profiles, anything I could get my hands on. I knew where he worked, where he lived, and most importantly, where he liked to spend his time. I wasn't about to show up at his office and confront him, that would have been too easy. Instead, I started piecing together his life, figuring out the places he frequented and the people he surrounded himself with. It wasn't long before I found my opening. Michael liked to network. A lot. I found out through a couple of mutual connections that he was big on building relationships outside of work, especially with high-profile clients. Fancy dinners, expensive wine, charity events, you name it. He was always there, rubbing elbows with the people who mattered in his world. And it was at one of these events, a fundraiser for some environmental cause, that I saw my chance. I wasn't going to just show up and call him out in front of a crowd. No, I had a better plan. I had the texts between him and Nicole, the emails, everything. I'd saved every screenshot, every detail from her phone and the hotel reservations. And I had something better, a few more messages I'd uncovered between them that had crossed a professional line. Michael had been helping Nicole with a couple of her projects at work, nothing major, but it was enough to suggest that they'd mixed business with their personal affair. He was mentoring her, giving her insider information about certain deals, and that was something I knew could ruin him if it got out. That night, I didn't go to the charity event. But I knew someone who did. Tom, my lawyer. He was a well-connected guy, and it didn't take much convincing to get him to help me out. He was all too happy to get involved when I told him what I had in mind. The night of the event, Tom walked into that fundraiser with a folder in his hand, a neatly organized package with every piece of evidence I had gathered on Michael Bennett and his affair with Nicole. But the real key was the business details, the messages that showed him crossing professional lines. Tom didn't hand the folder directly to Michael. That would have been too obvious. No, he handed it to one of Michael's most important clients, a guy who was heavily invested in Michael's company and known for his no-nonsense attitude. I didn't have to be there to know what happened next. By the next morning, the news was out. Michael's reputation had been hit hard. Rumors started circulating in his industry, whispers about inappropriate relationships, potential conflicts of interest, and shady business dealings. It wasn't long before his company caught wind of it, and when they did, they wasted no time launching an internal investigation. The messages between him and Nicole were damning, not just because of the affair, but because they hinted at insider trading and misuse of company resources. I'd been careful with how I framed everything, making sure it looked like he'd been sloppy with his work and his personal life. The company couldn't ignore it, and soon, Michael found himself suspended pending investigation. I kept my distance from the whole thing, watching from the sidelines as his life unraveled. The satisfaction I felt wasn't immediate, it was slow and steady, like watching a fire burn down something that had taken years to build. Michael wasn't just losing his job. He was losing his reputation, his credibility in the industry, and everything he'd worked so hard to maintain. I found out through some contacts that his wife had left him, too. Turns out, I wasn't the only one getting cheated on. His wife had found out about the affair the same way I had, through his phone. And when she did, she didn't stick around. She filed for divorce the day after she found out, and she didn't make it quiet. She wanted everyone to know what kind of man Michael Bennett really was. That was just the beginning. A few weeks after the fundraiser, I heard through the grapevine that Michael had been let go from his firm. They couldn't afford to keep someone with his baggage on the payroll, not with the kind of deals they were handling. The investigation had turned up enough dirt to make him a liability, and they cut him loose without much ceremony. He was out of a job, his marriage was over, and his name had been dragged through the mud. But I wasn't done yet. I still had the messages, the proof of his affair with Nicole, and I wasn't going to let that die quietly either. I knew a couple of journalists who loved a good scandal, especially when it involved high-profile people. I made sure they got their hands on everything they needed to write a story about Michael Bennett and his fall from grace. The affair, the insider trading allegations, the corporate drama, it all made for a perfect storm. The article hit the news a few days later, and it was brutal. The headline alone was enough to destroy what little reputation he had left. High-flying banker falls from grace amid scandalous affair and insider trading allegations. It wasn't just the business world that knew about it, now everyone did. His name was plastered all over the internet, and there was no escaping the fallout. Michael tried to lay low after that, but the damage had already been done. He was blacklisted from the industry, his professional contacts cutting ties with him one by one. His wife took him for everything he had, and by the time the dust settled, he was nothing more than a cautionary tale, a man who had it all and lost it because he couldn't keep his personal life in check. I didn't feel bad for him. Not for a second. He'd made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. Watching his life fall apart was the closure I needed, the final piece of the puzzle that let me walk away from this whole mess with my head held high. I didn't want to think about Nicole anymore. I didn't want to think about the nights she'd spent with him, or the lies she'd told me. But knowing that the man she'd thrown everything away for was now just as broken as our marriage had been, that gave me peace. It wasn't just about getting revenge. It was about making sure that he didn't walk away from this unscathed. He'd been part of the problem, and now, he was paying for it. As the weeks passed, I moved on with my life. Nicole was out of the house, the divorce was in full swing, and Michael was nothing more than a distant memory. I found myself thinking less and less about what had happened, focusing instead on rebuilding what had been torn apart. But every now and then, I'd hear a whisper about Michael Bennett, how he was struggling to find work, how he'd lost everything. And every time, I smiled. Because I knew that in the end, he got exactly what he deserved. Revenge wasn't the end of the story. It wasn't the thing that brought me closure or made me feel whole again. But it was a necessary step. Michael had to pay for his part in all of this, and now that he had, I could finally move on. It was time to stop looking back and start figuring out what came next. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to do just that. The day Nicole finally came to collect her things, it felt like closing the last chapter of a book I never wanted to read in the first place. I'd been staying in the house while the divorce was working its way through the courts, and she'd been living in some short-term rental downtown. The place was only a few miles away, but it might as well have been on the other side of the world. I hadn't seen her in weeks, not since she'd signed the divorce papers. Most of our communication had been through our lawyers, with the occasional terse email about dividing up the remaining stuff. When she texted to say she'd be by to grab her things, I didn't respond. I didn't feel like having another conversation with her. Everything that needed to be said had already been said, or at least, I thought so. But when she arrived that afternoon, something was different. She knocked on the door, even though she still had her key. It was the kind of small gesture that made me grit my teeth. Like she was trying to show me she still had some respect left. I opened the door without a word and stepped aside to let her in. She didn't rush past me or avoid my gaze. Instead, she paused in the doorway, her eyes meeting mine for a moment before looking down at the floor. "Hey," she said quietly, her voice almost hesitant. I didn't respond. I just turned and walked back into the living room, where I'd set aside her boxes. She followed, closing the door behind her. The tension in the room was thick, the air heavy with everything we'd been through. "I didn't expect you to be here," she said, glancing at the boxes stacked neatly by the couch. "I live here," I replied coldly, sitting down in the armchair across the room. "You're the one who left." Nicole flinched at the harshness in my tone but didn't argue. Instead, she walked over to the boxes, her hands running over the labels I'd written on each one. Clothes. Photos. Kitchen stuff. I'd packed it all myself, wanting to get it out of the house as quickly as possible. I didn't want any part of her lingering in my space anymore. "I didn't know you'd go through everything," she said softly, pulling open one of the boxes and glancing inside. "I thought I'd pack my own stuff." "I wanted it gone," I replied flatly, not looking at her. "Didn't see the point in dragging it out." Nicole nodded, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Yeah. I guess that makes sense." For a few minutes, she moved quietly around the room, sorting through her things, checking to make sure everything was there. I stayed in my chair, watching her but saying nothing. I could feel the words building up inside me, the questions I hadn't asked yet, the ones that had been gnawing at me since the day I found out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I couldn't take it anymore. "Why him?" The words came out sharper than I intended, slicing through the silence. Nicole froze, her hand resting on the edge of a box. Slowly, she turned to face me, her eyes wide, as if she didn't understand the question. I repeated it. "Why him? Why Michael Bennett?" She swallowed, her throat bobbing visibly as she struggled to find the words. I don't know," she stammered. "It just happened." "That's not an answer," I snapped. "You had to know what you were doing. You had to know it was going to destroy everything." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel bad for her. I didn't care if she cried. I wanted the truth. "I wasn't thinking," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't plan it. It just started. And once it did, I didn't know how to stop it." "Didn't know how to stop it," I repeated bitterly. "You could have stopped it by not going to the hotel. You could have stopped it by telling me the truth before it got out of hand." "I know," she whispered, her tears spilling over now. "I know I should have. But I was scared. I didn't know how to tell you." I let out a harsh laugh. "You didn't know how to tell me? You didn't think about how it would feel when I found out? When I had to go digging through your phone like some paranoid husband just to get the truth?" Nicole wiped at her eyes, but the tears kept coming. "I didn't want to hurt you," she choked out. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, congratulations," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "You did." She stood there, sobbing quietly, her face red and swollen from crying. Part of me wanted to get up and leave, to just walk out the door and let her deal with her own mess. But the other part of me, the part that still needed answers, couldn't let it go. "So what now?" I asked, my voice cold. "You think saying sorry is going to fix this? You think I'm just going to forget what you did?" Nicole shook her head, her hair falling in front of her face. "No. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it." "You're damn right you don't," I spat. You tore this marriage apart for some guy who probably doesn't even give a shit about you. And now, what? You want me to feel sorry for you because you feel guilty? She didn't answer, just stood there crying, her shoulders shaking with every sob. I stood up then, my fists clenched at my sides. I couldn't sit there anymore, couldn't listen to her pathetic excuses. You know, I used to think we could work through anything, I said, my voice low but steady. I used to think that no matter what, we'd find a way to fix things. But now? Now I don't even recognize you. Nicole's sobs grew louder, and she dropped her face into her hands, shaking uncontrollably. I'm sorry, she cried. I'm so sorry. But I didn't care about her apologies. I didn't care about her tears. She could cry all she wanted, it wouldn't change anything. I loved you, I said, my voice cracking slightly. I gave you everything. And you threw it all away. Her hands dropped from her face, and she looked up at me, her eyes filled with desperation. Please, she whispered. Please don't hate me. I stared at her for a long moment, the words stuck in my throat. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that she was nothing to me now. But the truth was, I didn't hate her. Not really. What I felt was worse. I felt nothing. And that scared me more than anything else. Nicole took her things and left that afternoon, her face streaked with tears, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She didn't ask for another chance. She didn't beg me to take her back. She knew it was over, just like I did. When the door closed behind her, the house felt different. It was quieter, emptier. But it wasn't the kind of quiet that came with peace. It was the kind of quiet that followed a storm, when all that's left is the wreckage. I sat down on the couch, staring at the spot where she had been standing, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself really think about everything that had happened. I let myself feel the weight of it all. The betrayal. The lies. The anger. The sadness. And in that moment, I realized something: Nicole's affair hadn't just destroyed our marriage. It had destroyed me. Because the man I was before this? He didn't exist anymore. I'd spent so much time focusing on getting revenge, on making sure Nicole and Michael paid for what they did, that I hadn't stopped to think about what came next. I'd been so wrapped up in the anger, in the need for justice, that I hadn't thought about what I was going to do once it was all over. And now that it was? Now that Nicole was gone, and Michael was out of the picture? I had no idea where to go from here. A few days later, I got a call from Tom, my lawyer. We're almost done, he said. Just waiting on the final court date. After that, you'll be free and clear. Free and clear. I'd been waiting to hear those words for weeks, and now that I had, I wasn't sure how to feel. Thanks, I muttered, hanging up the phone. I stared at the screen for a moment, then tossed it onto the coffee table. Free and clear. What did that even mean anymore? I had the house, the money, my life. But none of it felt like it mattered. Not after everything that had happened. Nicole hadn't fought me in court. She'd accepted the terms of the divorce, knowing that she didn't have a leg to stand on. She'd walked away with some cash, enough to get by, but not much else. I didn't care. I hadn't wanted her money. I just wanted